The producer challenged Jimi. Do it without your Strat. Jimi said nothing. He just reached for the other guitar. And what he played changed the producer's face forever. Olympic Studios, London, February 1968. 3 in the morning. The kind of hour when the city sleeps but studios breathe, when tape machines hum and cigarette smoke hangs in the air like ghosts of every song that's ever been recorded between these walls. Jimi Hendrix sat in the corner of Studio A, his white Stratocaster resting against his knee. He wasn't playing. Just sitting. Looking at the instrument the way some men look at the ocean, with recognition, with familiarity, with something that went deeper than words. The session had been going for 6 hours. They were working on a track that wasn't coming together. The engineer kept adjusting levels. The bassist had played the same line 40 times. The drummer was smoking his 5th cigarette of the hour. And Martin Webb, the producer, a man who'd worked with everyone from the Beatles to the Stones, who'd seen every guitar player London had to offer, who thought he'd heard everything there was to hear, sat behind the mixing console with his arms crossed. Jimi, Martin said, his voice carrying that particular British weariness that can cut through 6 hours of studio time like a blade. We're not getting it. Jimi looked up. Didn't speak. Just looked. The tone's wrong. Martin continued. Too clean. Too. Hendrix. I need something rawer. Uglier. Something that doesn't sound like you've been playing that guitar your entire life. The room got quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone pretends they're not listening while listening to every word. Jimi's fingers moved absently on the Stratocaster's neck. Still didn't speak. Martin stood up from the console. Walked across the studio floor to where a Gibson ES-335 sat on a stand. A rental guitar, nobody's instrument, just something the studio kept around for sessions. He picked it up. Walked over to Jimi. Held it out. Do it without your Strat, Martin said. Not angry. Not mocking. Just challenging. Testing. The way producers do when they think they know what a musician is capable of, and want to see if they're right. Jimi looked at the Gibson. Then at his Stratocaster. Then at Martin. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply reached out, took the Gibson, and set his Stratocaster carefully against the wall. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The Gibson felt wrong in his hands. Different weight. Different balance. The neck was thicker, the action higher, the strings responding with resistance instead of the Stratocaster's fluid obedience. Martin went back to the console, satisfied. He'd made his point. Sometimes you had to push musicians out of their comfort zone. Make them work for it. This was going to be good. Jimi adjusted the strap. Ran his thumb across the strings, not playing, just feeling. Learning this instrument the way you learn a new language, one syllable at a time. The engineer rolled tape. Martin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed again, waiting to hear Jimi struggle with unfamiliar territory. What happened next would stay with Martin Webb for the rest of his life. Jimi played a single note. Not a chord. Not a riff. Just one note. Bent it. Held it. Let it sustain until the room forgot what silence sounded like. The note was wrong. Intentionally wrong. Sharp enough to hurt, held long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, bent in a way that defied every rule of what a guitar note should do. And it was perfect. Martin's arms uncrossed. He leaned forward slowly. Jimi played another note. Lower. Darker. He made the Gibson sound like it was breathing. Like it was alive and angry and wounded all at once. The bassist stopped smoking. The drummer forgot he had hands. The engineer's finger hovered over the stop button but didn't press it. Jimi wasn't playing the song they'd been working on. He was playing something else entirely. Something that had never existed before and would never exist again, because this wasn't about the song. This was about the challenge. His fingers moved across the unfamiliar fretboard like they'd lived there forever. He found notes in that Gibson that the guitar itself didn't know it contained. He bent strings until they screamed. He created feedback that sounded like a conversation between the instrument and the room. He played for maybe 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes. Time stopped meaning anything. And then he stopped. Just stopped. Let the last note fade into nothing. Set the Gibson down on the floor, not roughly, not gently, just set it down like it was a tool he was finished using. Martin Webb sat perfectly still behind the console. His mouth was slightly open. One hand had come up to touch his face, his fingers pressed against his jaw like he was trying to confirm he was still sitting in the same room, in the same studio, on the same planet. The tape was still rolling. Nobody moved to stop it. Jimmy picked up his Stratocaster. Sat back down in the corner. Waited. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Martin stood up from the console. Slowly. Like someone who just witnessed something that required recalibration of everything he thought he understood. He walked across the studio floor to where Jimmy sat. "That," Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Jimmy looked at him. Still didn't speak. His eyes held something that wasn't pride or victory or satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. Like he'd answered a question that didn't need to be asked in the first place. "How did you do that?" Martin finally managed. "That guitar, you've never played that guitar before. How did you make it sound like?" "Like what?" Jimmy asked quietly. His first words in over an hour. "Like it was yours." Jimmy looked down at his Stratocaster, then at the Gibson lying on the floor. "It's all the same," he said. "Guitar's just wood and wire. What matters is what you're trying to say." Martin stared at him. Then he did something he'd never done in 15 years of producing records. He sat down on the floor. Right there. In the middle of the studio. Just sat. "I've worked with everyone," Martin said, more to himself than to Jimmy. "I've seen Eric. I've seen Jeff. I've seen Jimmy. And I thought I understood what mastery looked like. And now?" Jimmy asked. Martin looked up at him. "Now I understand I've been producing the wrong thing. I've been chasing sounds. You're not playing sounds. You're playing." He trailed off again. "Truth," Jimmy finished quietly. "Just playing what's true." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. To understand what happened in that studio, you need to understand what didn't happen. Jimi Hendrix didn't get angry when challenged. Didn't argue. Didn't explain why the challenge was pointless. He simply picked up an unfamiliar instrument and demonstrated something that Martin Webb, veteran producer, accomplished musician, man who thought he'd seen it all, had never fully understood until that moment. The guitar wasn't the source of the music. Jimmy was. The Stratocaster wasn't his voice. It was just the most familiar translation of his voice. But the voice existed independent of the instrument. The voice was in his fingers, in his understanding of tension and release, in his relationship with sound itself. Take away his guitar, and he'd make another guitar speak in his language. That Gibson, a rental, a nobody's instrument, had lived in that studio for 3 years. Session musicians had played it. Professionals had used it for backup parts. It had recorded 100 songs. In Jimmy's hands, for 90 seconds, it became something else entirely. Martin Webb didn't use the recording. The track they were working on was eventually cut with different takes, released to moderate success, forgotten within a year. But Martin kept the tape. He labeled it Gibson Session February 1968, and put it in his private archive. He never told anyone about it for years, not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because he didn't have words to explain what it meant. Years later, after Jimmy was gone, Martin would play that tape for young producers who came to him asking how to work with difficult artists. "Listen to this," he'd say, cueing it up. "I challenged him. I took away his security blanket. I thought I was teaching him something about range, about stepping outside comfort zones. The young producers would listen to Jimi make that Gibson sing. "What did he teach you instead?" they'd ask. "That mastery isn't about the tools," Martin would say. "It's about truth." He played truth. And truth doesn't need a specific guitar. It just needs to be heard. The room where it happened still exists. Olympic Studios, now called Angelic Studios. Different owners, different equipment, but the same room. Same walls. Same floor where Martin Webb sat down and had his understanding of music quietly shattered. Musicians who record there sometimes ask about it. The engineers know the story, or versions of it anyway. Details change depending on who's telling it. But the core remains the same. Jimi Hendrix proved something that night that no one asked him to prove. He proved that his genius wasn't in his fingers or his Stratocaster, or his effects pedals. It was in his relationship with sound itself. His understanding that music is conversation, between instrument and player, between player and room, between truth and listener. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. After that night, Martin Webb produced differently. He stopped obsessing over gear. Stopped telling guitarists they needed a specific amp or a specific guitar to achieve a specific sound. He'd seen what Jimi did with a rental Gibson, and it had broken something in him that needed breaking. The instrument, he'd tell musicians in later sessions, is just a microphone for your ideas. Make sure you have something worth amplifying first. Some took it as arrogance. Others understood it as the hardest lesson Martin had ever learned. The bassist from that session, a man named Terry who'd played on 100 records and would play on 100 more, told people about that night for the rest of his career. "I watched Jimi pick up a guitar he'd never touched," Terry would say in interviews, in studios, in bars after sessions, "and make it sound like he'd played it his entire life. No warm-up. No adjustment period. Just truth. That's the only word for it. He played the truth of what that moment needed, and the guitar didn't matter." The engineer, a quiet man named David who rarely spoke about sessions out of professional discretion, made an exception for this one. "I've recorded everyone," David said years later, near the end of his career. "And I can tell you this, most musicians are translators. They have an idea, and they use the instrument to translate it into sound. But Jimi was fluent. He thought in music. Gave him any guitar, any amp, any room, he'd speak the same language. The rest of us just got to listen." The Gibson ES-335 that Jimi played that night stayed at Olympic Studios for another 5 years. Eventually it was sold to a collector who didn't know its history. It's out there somewhere now, probably in someone's home, probably being played by someone who has no idea that for 90 seconds in 1968, it was the instrument that taught a legendary producer the difference between technique and truth. But here's what matters. Jimi Hendrix walked into that studio with his Stratocaster. He left with his Stratocaster. The Gibson stayed behind. But something invisible went with him. The proof that mastery has nothing to do with comfort, and everything to do with understanding. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Martin Webb died in 2003. In his personal effects, his family found a reel-to-reel tape labeled The Gibson Session. They digitized it. They listened to it once. His daughter said later, "We didn't understand what we were hearing at first. It was just guitar. And then my father's voice on the tape, barely audible, my God. That's all he said." Just those 2 words. The tape is still private. The family keeps it that way. Some things aren't meant to be shared, they're meant to be kept as reminders. Martin Webb kept a note in his desk drawer for the rest of his career. He'd written it the morning after that session. The guitar didn't change. Jimi showed us what was always there. Years after Jimi was gone, a young guitarist visited Martin in his final months. Asked him, what was Jimi really like? Martin closed his eyes. He never needed to prove anything. That's what made him dangerous. He just played truth, and truth doesn't argue. The Gibson stayed in studios. Changed hands. Got played by hundreds of musicians who never knew. But somewhere in Olympic Studios' walls, in the wood and the air, that 90 seconds still exists. The moment a master picked up a stranger's tool and reminded everyone that genius isn't in the instrument. It's in the hands. And more than that. It's in knowing what to say when the room goes quiet.